a little excerpt of a book that I'm writing about this story. So here we go. The 15-minute ride from the hotel to the prison had the kind of view remarkable for its downstate Illinois averageness, an ongoing canvas of flat, dry land spotted with clusters of cattle and capped with a dull November sky. The homes, although visibly occupied, were far apart and seemed to possess a bleak loneliness, amplified by the rain. After driving by the CMU's deserted checkpoint, our car approached a stop sign, but this wasn't your usual stop sign. This was where Justice Drive met Prison Road. I'm getting out, I said. Why, Mother asked. Because I need to document this, I said. They can probably see you, she said. No, they can't. Trust me, Noor, they can see you. Don't worry, Mother, it's just a picture, I said. Zipping up my jacket and setting my iPhone on camera mode, I stepped out of the car. I captured a few close-ups of the signs and a few shots of my 14-year-old brother leaning against the pole. He took some of me making a confounded face while pointing at the street names. Then we raced back to the rental car, feeling uplifted despite being soaking wet. The architecture of the prison facade with its gray diamond pattern resembled that of a small abandoned museum. The visitation was scheduled for 10 a.m., which meant we had precisely 17 minutes to park the car, sign in, clear the metal detectors, sprint down the hallway painted with its misplaced bright green stripe, pass through the common visitation area, and finally enter the room with a plexiglass barrier. I greeted the man behind the front desk, the same pleasant man with the prominent eyebrows who had been stationed there the day before, and I quickly started to fill out the requisite paperwork. When I looked up, I saw two uniformed figures in my peripheral vision, a fat, smirking fellow and a slim female guard. Ma'am, we were noticed that you were taking photos of our facility, said the smirking fellow, whose strict southern tone came across as jolly when coupled with his southern accent. I thought for a moment, but before I could utter a word, Mother interjected, "She's writing a book. She's just doing research for her book." I stared at Mother with a face that begged to ask, why would you say that? But seeing that the two guards were waiting for my answer, I turned to them and said, I wasn't taking photos of your facility, I was just taking photos of some street signs. Well, ma'am, for security reasons, we're going to have to see those photos. Can we do this afterwards, I said. I'd really rather not take time away from my father's visitation. A loan would take a minute, ma'am, he said. All right, I'll be right back, I said. The slim female guard stepped forward. Actually, we're coming with you. You want to follow me to the car, I asked. Yes, they both replied. My 15-year-old brother Muhammad insisted on coming too. This was more unexpected than being followed by the security duo. I'd been away from my brothers for almost a year and a half in New York to pursue an MFA, but I clearly remembered their confusion in my father's absence, their outbursts, their threats to run away. It was striking to see the young men they had become. Somehow, walking alongside my brother, a blue-eyed, straight jeans-clad former skateboarder and soccer champion, made me feel less demoralized. For what are siblings but an intolerable but indispensable part of your flesh? When we returned to the car, I flipped through the photos one by one, while the man with the smirk decided whether I should keep it or not. At one point, a break in the clouds produced a subtle glare on the screen. He pulled it away from his hand, saying, I can't really see what's on this machine right now. I discarded each of the street sign photos, becoming gradually more disheartened as I went. The only pictures they let me keep were the ones of cows I'd taken the day before. On our way back to the prison lobby, the Southern Guard told me that if the man in the tower catches me taking any more photos of their facility, I would be banned from visiting my father for an unspecified amount of time. So this is a glimpse into this ordeal, this injustice that has been going on for more than a year. And like Jared said, my father, Lieutenant Ashi, was part of what was deemed to be the most extensive terror funding case in U.S. history. He co-founded the Holy Land Foundation, a humanitarian organization, in the late 1980s, and remaining involved as an unpaid board member. My father watched his project thrive, becoming the largest American Muslim charity, giving money not only to Palestinian charities, but also to other countries across the world, including the U.S. But in December of 2001, President Bush shut down the HLF by executive order. Then in 2004, my father and 4 other men, dubbed the Holy Land Five, were charged with conspiring to provide material support to charities linked to designated terrorist groups. This support came in the form of humanitarian aid to Palestinian charities that prosecutors were claiming, quote, worked on behalf of Hamas. What was perplexing for the first jury, which returned no guilty verdicts and deadlocked on most counts, was that these Palestinian charities, called Zakat committees, also received funds from our own government agencies, like most notably USAID and other international NGOs. And none of these committees, as my father's attorneys argued, were in fact listed as designated terrorist groups by the Department of Treasury. And John Klein, my father's lawyer, is going to speak in more detail about all of that. One juror went as far as questioning the credibility of the prosecution's key witness, an Israeli intelligence officer who testified under a pseudonym. That was obvious. Even so, a second trial in 2008 ended with all guilty verdicts. And Baba, I call him Baba, received a sentence of 65 years. On sentencing day, he said, "Nothing in my life was as satisfactory as knowing that I could sign a check. It is the only evidence you have used against me, signing the check. But that was the most enjoyable part of my life and rewarding, knowing that I could sign a check to assist thousands of Palestinian families who got displaced after their homes were demolished. Nothing was more satisfactory to me than providing scholarships to hundreds of Palestinian students who had high average grades despite their circumstance. Nothing was more rewarding to me than being a catalyst in turning Zakat into real-life assistance to orphans and needy families." So that was my father, and that is why he's in prison. My father's now in the Communications Management Unit, which I read about in the beginning. And just to give you a very basic idea, these units are, they were opened during the Bush administration, and there's one in Illinois and one in Indiana. And they're aimed at restricting communications, as they're called, Communications Management Unit, with the inmates and outside world, including the attorneys and family members. They get like a fraction of the phone time that they got in the other prison, and they get a fraction of the visitation time. Everything has to be scheduled in advance and live monitored from Washington, D.C. So at this point, after 2009, when my father was sentenced, basically what happened is it went under appeal, and it would continue to be unsuccessfully appealed until very recently the Supreme Court declined to hear it in October of 2012, ending any possibility of a reversal through the justice system. Yet the story will not end here, and I always tell my father he will remain in the consciousness of many as long as I'm alive. But to put it very simply, I view my father as the Fred Kuramatsu of our time. And Fred Kuramatsu, after Pearl Harbor, was among the 120,000 Japanese Americans ordered to live in internment camps. Mr. Kuramatsu defied orders to be interned because he viewed the forced removal as unconstitutional. So on May 30th, 1942, Mr. Korematsu was arrested. His case was argued all the way to the Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled against him, stating that his jailing was justified due to military necessity. Nearly 40 years later, in 1983, Korematsu's case was reopened, 40 years, was reopened, and on November 10th, 1983, the conviction was overturned. And Judge Patel notably said, quote, "It stands as a caution that in times of international hostility, our institutions, legislative, executive, and judicial, must be prepared to exercise their authority to protect all citizens from the petty fears and prejudices that are so easily aroused." So I'm just going to end here. I don't know if it's been 15 minutes or how long it's been, but I'm going to end here, and I'm just going to say that I really do hope that my father's vindication does not take 40 years. And I think that we can learn from our old wrongs, and I think that really the best way that all of you can help is just to continue to tell the story. And you can hear it today, and imagine if each of you told another 10 people, and those 10 people told another 10 people, and I think it will continue to inspire outrage in, communities all across the country. So thank you so much for listening.
Next up, we have John Klein, lawyer for the Holy Land Five, and he'll be speaking about the trial process and the prosecution of the Holy Land Five.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little more about the case that Noor was just describing. She was talking about her father, my client, who is serving a sentence of 65 years, which for a man of his age is a life sentence, for providing charity to needy people in the West Bank. That is what he did. Every couple of generations, there is a case that tests our country's judicial system. Sometimes the judicial system comes through with flying colors, and sometimes it fails. Some of the failures are cases that we all know. Dred Scott versus Sandford, where back in 1857 the Supreme Court concluded that slaves were not citizens, they were property. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where the Supreme Court held with one dissent that separate but equal was okay, so that African American people could be put in separate train cars and sent to separate schools. And as long as somebody thought that they were equal, that was okay. Noor talked about the Korematsu case from 1943, where tens of thousands of patriotic Japanese Americans were sent to, we call them internment camps, but they were prisons. We locked them up for years because they were alleged to be, based on what turned out to be false evidence, a threat to national security. The Holy Land case, which I'm now going to talk about in a little bit of detail, is another case like this. It is, as Noor says, it is the Korematsu of our time. The Holy Land Foundation in 2001 was the largest Muslim charity in the United States. It gave aid to needy people all over the world, not just in Palestine, but also in places like the former Yugoslavia and Chechnya and the United States. It gave aid when the Murrah Federal Building was bombed in Oklahoma City. One of the first entities to provide aid was the Holy Land Foundation. It was in many ways a mainstream organization. It had tie-ins, for example, with American Airlines. It was the largest and most established Muslim charitable organization in the country. 9/11 happened. I think if we put our minds back, we can all recall the sort of fear and frenzy that gripped this country after 9/11. And one of the things that happened in the wake of that terrible event, and in the the midst of that fear and frenzy was that under President Bush's watch, the Holy Land Foundation was shut down. Just one day, federal agents came in and they closed it down. So fast forward now to 2004. And as Noor said, in 2004 in Dallas, in federal court, prosecutors indicted 5 former members of the Holy Land Foundation and the foundation itself. One of those people indicted was Ghassan Alashi. And I had the privilege of representing Mr. Alashi along with my friend Linda Marino, who just happens to be here with us. Now, the government's theory of the case was that the Holy Land Foundation and the men who were charged were providing material support to Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization. The problem with the government's theory, one problem was that not a penny of Holy Land money ever actually went to Hamas. Not a penny of Holy Land money ever went to anybody affiliated with Hamas. Not a penny of Holy Land money ever went to fund a suicide bomb or an act of violence anywhere in the world. And so linking the Holy Land Foundation and linking Ghassan Alashi to terrorism was a bit of a stretch. Now, the way the government tried to solve that problem, as Noor outlined, was to allege that the Holy Land Foundation gave its money through local charitable committees in the West Bank, called Zakat committees, and Zakat simply means charity. And these local committees were very well established and used by a number of entities because they were known to be honest. There's a lot of fraud and graft that goes on in that part of the world. And these charitable organizations, these Zakat committees, were known to be honest. They also were local. They were right there in the community, and so they knew who was needy and who wasn't. So if you wanted to give charity, if you wanted to get to the people who needed it, these were good groups to use. They were so good that not only did the Holy Land Foundation use them, but our government used some of the same ones that the Holy Land Foundation was indicted for using. The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, used some of these same Zakat committees. The Red Cross, or the Red Crescent, used some of these same committees. The United Nations used some of these same committees. So these were not some fly-by-night secret little conspiratorial groups. These were well-established local committees. So that was one problem that the government had with this case. Another problem was that, as Noor suggested, starting in 1995, the United States listed all of the terrorist organizations. They put them on a list so that if somebody wanted to give aid somewhere in the world and they wanted to make sure they weren't giving it to a terrorist, they could consult this list and see whether they were doing anything wrong. None of these Zakat committees, no one ever associated with any of these Zakat committees, was ever on the list. Not in 1995, not in 2004, not even by the end of the trial in the Holy Land case. Never listed. So that was another one. A third problem was that when the list first came out in 1995, President Clinton issued this list, and it listed Hamas, listed some other terrorist groups. A bunch of prominent Muslim Americans, including, as it happens, Ghassan Alashi, traveled up to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Treasury Department, which is the part of the executive branch that publishes this list, to meet with the Treasury Department and find out what the list meant. They all went up there, they had this big meeting with the very top people in the Treasury Department who deal with this issue, and they said, give us guidance. Tell us what we can do and what we can't do, because we're giving a part of the world that you're obviously concerned about. And the Treasury Department told them, in essence, look at the list, we can't tell you anything else. And of course, these Zakat committees weren't on the list. So that was another problem the government had with its case. And then there was the fact that the Holy Land Foundation, starting in about 1998 or 1999, hired a former congressman from Dallas named John Bryant, a lawyer, to go to the Department of Justice, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, even to the Israeli embassy in D.C., and find out whether anything the Holy Land Foundation was doing was a problem. Because, of course, that's a complicated part of the world. They wanted to make sure they were doing things right. John Bryant, the lawyer, the former congressman, went to these agencies, went to the Israeli embassy, and nobody ever, he even went to the FBI. He had several meetings with the FBI. He said, if we're doing something wrong, tell us and we'll stop. Nobody ever hinted that there was a problem with what the Holy Land Foundation was doing. So those were problems that the government had with its theory that somehow by giving aid through these zakat committees that were not on the list and that our own government used, the Holy Land Foundation was supporting Hamas. Now the government tried to overcome that in a number of ways, but two of them are worth mentioning here. One of them is that they called an anonymous expert. Now, just to give you a sense, and when I say anonymous, I don't just mean the jury didn't know who he was, or maybe the spectator didn't know who he was. No, the defense lawyers didn't know who he was. They didn't tell us who this man was. He told us he was from Israeli security. He told us that he had a law degree from Tel Aviv University. He told us he was an expert on Hamas. But of course, we couldn't check any of that out. As he put it, kind of with a smirk, we couldn't research it. He said, you can't research it. You're right. Now, to give you an idea of how really bizarre that is, I want you to imagine that as we're leaving here tonight, I get confused and I run into your car and I cause some damage. And you decide you're going to sue me. And you hire an expert. And I hire an expert. Well, not only could I know the name of your expert and knew the name of mine, I could take his deposition. I could go to his colleagues and find out what his reputation was. I could look up all of his publications. I could look at whether he'd ever been disciplined for anything that he'd done wrong. I could get his other testimony from other cases, and I could read it and see if it was inconsistent with what he was saying in my case. You could do the same thing. And then when we came to trial, you'd know my expert, I'd know your expert, and we could really expose the truth to the jury. That's in a case where, let's say if I really hit you hard, there's $10,000 worth of damage. You'd have that right, and I would have that right. In this case, where we're talking about sending people to prison for the rest of their lives, we weren't permitted to know the name of the key government witness in the case. To this day, I can't tell you the man's name. He went by a pseudonym. He went by the pseudonym of Adam, EBI. That's all that we know of. There was a second anonymous witness too, less important. But just the fact that we had two anonymous witnesses, this was the first case, as far as I know, in the history of American law, where an anonymous expert has been permitted to testify. Not just in a criminal case, which is particularly bad because the criminal defendant is supposed to have constitutional rights, but in any kind of case. This is the first time. It now is not the only time because, of course, once it happens in our case, it starts to happen in other cases as well. But this was the first time. So that was one thing the government did. The other thing the government did to try to overcome the problems with its case was put in at every opportunity, and it had a judge who was willing to give the government anything it wanted. If the government wanted it, the judge would allow it. They put in pictures of blown up buses. They put in testimony about the horrible things that Hamas does to Israeli civilians. They put in that type of evidence in great detail, even though it had absolutely nothing to do with anything the Holy Land Foundation had ever done, and nothing to do with anything Ghassan al-Lashi had ever done, and in fact was contrary to Ghassan al-Lashi's view of how the problems in that part of the world ought to be worked out. The judge allowed all that evidence. So now, imagine you're in front of a Dallas jury, that type of evidence is coming in, the anonymous expert gets to testify. But a miracle happened. A miracle happened. In 2007, a Dallas jury refused to convict a single defendant on a single count. Not one conviction. One man was acquitted on all but one count, and on every other count, as to every other defendant, including Ghassan, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. You can imagine how embarrassing that was for the government. So the government decided, as it is permitted to do under the law in this country, to retry the case. And so in 2008, we come back to Dallas, we have a different jury, and as it happens, a different judge who is even more forgiving to the government than the first judge, and we have a second trial. And for the second trial, the government doesn't want to have this problem again. It does not want to be embarrassed again. And so it tries to pump up its case a little bit. And it pumps up its case with 4 types of evidence. The first type of evidence was testimony from a man named Shorbaji, who was a cooperator. He had been born in the Gaza Strip. He had never been to the West Bank in his life, and he hadn't been back to the Gaza Strip since, I think, in the early 90s. Nonetheless, the judge allowed Shorbaji to testify that everybody on the West Bank, where he had never been, knew that the Holy Land Foundation was part of Hamas. And so that testimony comes in trial. I needn't tell you that we objected vigorously to all this evidence. The second bit of evidence that was not permitted in the first trial, or offered in the first trial, but came in the second, was from a man named Steve Simon, who had been on the National Security Council in 1995 when President Clinton designated Hamas a terrorist organization. And Mr. Simon was allowed to testify that part of the reason that Hamas was designated was to prevent, through some fairly complicated logic that I won't trouble you with, to prevent 9/11 style attacks on the United States. So, and the government persuaded the judge to allow that evidence because, according to the government, it was important for the jurors to understand why something that went on in that part of the world was relevant to them. So now they see that it's relevant to them because the fact that the Holy Land Foundation is feeding hungry children and buying backpacks and maybe funding a hospital or two in the West Bank through these Zakat committees could lead to another 9/11 style attack on the United States. That was the inference that the jury was asked to draw. So that was the second piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence, new, not offered in the first trial, was from a man named Robert McBrien, who worked at the Treasury Department. And his job was to come in. We had made quite an issue in that first trial of the fact that these Zakat committees weren't on that list. The Treasury Department has a list of terrorist organizations. The Zakat committees weren't on them. And therefore, what's this all about? We made quite a deal out of that, as you can imagine, in the first trial, and we made quite a deal out of it in the second trial. Mr. McBrien came in to testify as an authoritative voice from the Department of Treasury that it didn't make any difference whether you were on the list or not. Don't worry about that, jury. It doesn't matter. He was allowed to give that testimony. And then the fourth new piece of evidence, bit of evidence, was some documents. In 2002, the Israeli army, led by one of our anonymous witnesses, by the way, went into the West Bank, not with the permission, you understand, of the Palestinian Authority. They went in somewhat violently. They rampaged through the Zakat committees. They also rampaged through the Palestinian Authority headquarters. And our anonymous witness told us, one of the anonymous witnesses, that in the wreckage of the Palestinian Authority headquarters, they had found some documents. They didn't know who wrote the documents. They didn't know what sources the documents relied on. But the documents, which were put into evidence in the second trial, said that the Holy Land Foundation was the fundraising arm for Hamas. Now, how did those come into evidence? What was the source? Your guess is as good as mine, but in they came. So those were the key differences between the first trial, where there was not a single guilty verdict, and the second trial. And as Nord told you, in the second trial, everybody got convicted on every count. We go forward to sentencing a few months later, and the sentences were, of all the many outrages in this case, the sentences probably are the most outrageous. 65 years for Hassan al-Ashi, a life sentence. 65 years for another of the leaders of the Holy Land Foundation. Lesser sentences for the others, but still long enough for some of them to be effectively life sentences. Just to give you an idea of how just crazy, outrageous those sentences are. The victim here, supposedly, was Israel, right? And Hamas launches its terror attacks against Israel and Israeli sentences. So we thought it might be interesting to see what kind of sentence Hassan al-Ashi and the other defendant would have received if they'd been convicted of the same offense in an Israeli court. And when I say an Israeli court, I don't mean an Israeli civilian court. I mean an Israeli military court, which is where people like Hassan get tried. And the answer was they get sentences of, the sentences range from about 6 months to about 4 years. So the Israelis The Israelis would impose a sentence of 6 months to 4 years for an offense, if you can call it that got, in this country, 65-year sentences for Kasana Washington. It is just an unspeakable outrage. So, we go forward to appeal. And we write elaborate briefs. We go down to New Orleans. We have an argument in front of 3 judges who take it very seriously and compliment us all in our fine briefing. Months pass while they write their opinion. One day it comes. And the convictions are affirmed. The convictions, the sentences, everything is affirmed. Now, the court wasn't troubled by the fact that there was an anonymous witness. It in fact said, you know, we didn't come forward and say what we would have found if we had known the witness's name. Now, think about that. Sort of a catch-22, but that's what the court said. You know, we didn't tell them what we would have found if we'd known the witness's name, and so therefore, how are we? But what was really appalling about the Court of Appeals decision, I mean, the whole decision is appalling, but what was really appalling about it is that they found 4 errors. And those errors were the Shorbaji testimony about what everybody knew on the West Bank, shouldn't have come in. The Simon testimony about another 9/11 style attack, preventing that by designating Hamas, that shouldn't come in. The McBrien testimony, that fellow from the Treasury Department came in and talked about how he didn't have to worry whether the Zakat committees were listed. There was error to admit that. And those documents that were found in the wreckage of the Palestinian Authority headquarters, those shouldn't have come in either. All that was error. But guess what? It was harmless. It didn't make any difference to the outcome. Harmless. We don't have to worry about it. Now, you're not lawyers. Maybe some of you are, but most of you probably aren't. So just for a second, use your common sense. We have a first trial where not a single defendant is convicted. We have a second trial where every defendant is convicted on every count. And the main difference between those 2 cases is those 4 pieces of evidence. Does that sound harmless to you? But that's what the Court of Appeals said. We asked the Supreme Court to take the case. It turned it down and never has to explain why. And that, as Noor says, is largely the end of the judicial process for Kasana Washington. Now, I have to tell you that when the Court of Appeals rendered that decision, I thought seriously about just quitting the practice of law. I thought, if this country will do that, it's not worth practicing law. But I didn't. And I didn't for a couple of reasons. One is, think back to those cases that I named at the beginning. Think about Dred Scott versus Sandford. When that case was decided, I'm sure it was greeted with probably approval by most people. But a few years later, we have a civil war, we have the 13th and 14th Amendments, slavery is abolished, it gets overturned. Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. One dissent, 8-1 from the Supreme Court. That separate but equal is fine. It's okay to keep African Americans in separate cars and separate bathrooms and separate dining halls. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court reversed that and said separate but equal is not okay. Separate is inherently unequal. Korematsu, as Noor said, in 1943, Fred Korematsu, the Supreme Court, I think 7-2, says it's just fine to lock up innocent Japanese Americans on national security grounds and keep them in prison for years. But in 1984, a judge in the Northern District of California finally said that that was just wrong. And I think even before that, everybody had come to recognize that that was one of the great travesties in this country's history. So my hope is that this will be another of those cases. And I hope, like Noor, that it doesn't take the 41 years it took Fred Korematsu to achieve justice. So that's one thing that keeps me going, that things do change. There is always hope, no matter how bleak the prospects look. But the second thing is that, and this goes back to something Ghassan al-Ashi himself said at a time when he didn't even know he was being listened to. One of the things about this case, one of the many little horrors that's not even worth mentioning given the much bigger horrors, our government recorded Hassan and the others for years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, tapped their phones, read their emails, read their faxes, had bugs in the Holy Land Foundation itself, listened to their phone calls. I mean, can you imagine if your own lives were scrutinized that way? Just imagine for a second. You've got the FBI listening day in and day out to every call you make, every email you send. Just imagine. That's what these guys went through. And in one of those calls, in 1996, it was at a time when the government, there was a rumor going around that the government might actually list the Zakat committees as terrorist organizations. And so Ghassan was talking with his colleague at the Holy Land Foundation, whose name was Shukri Abu Bakr, about what the Holy Land Foundation would do if the Zakat committees were listed. And Ghassan was outraged at the thought that these charity committees that our own government used could be treated as terrorist organizations. And Shukri Abu Bakr said to him, look, Ghassan, if they're listed, we have to follow the law. We can't give to them. And Ghassan said, I know we have to follow the law. But if that happens, I will be, and these are his words, severely outspoken. Well, that's what I'm going to do. And I hope that that's what you will be, severely outspoken. Not violent, Ghassan al-Afshi will never be violent. Not disrespectful, but severely outspoken. That's my hope for you.
Next up, we have Mick Kelly, a 40-year anti-war and Palestine solidarity activist, as well as editor for Fight Back News. Mick, along with 23 other activists, had their homes raided as part of a grand jury investigation for material support for terrorism. Mick.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this truly important event. I think what we've heard today is about an injustice that we really have to raise a call about, speak out about, and demand that this great, great crime be reversed. We can't stand for it, we can't put up with it. Again, the organizers have done a wonderful thing, putting this event together, and I'm honored to speak today with you all. You know, the last time I was here speaking was for the protest at the Republican National Convention. And I was speaking on behalf of the Coalition to March on the RNC. And today I'm speaking on the Committee to Stop FBI, on behalf of the Committee to Stop FBI Repression, and the work that we've been doing to push back these political attacks against those of us who will stand up to U.S. wars, U.S. attacks on others, and occupations that are taking place around the world. The reality of the situation is the U.S. is like a frightened giant. The empire is slipping from its hand and it's lashing out at people here at home. And just to tell you a little bit what happened to me. On September 24th, 2010, I was at work and I got a call from my wife. She says, they're here. I said, what? She says, they're here. It's about 7:30 in the morning. I work as a cook. She says, well, the FBI is here, tearing the place up. So I come home, get to my house, and I have a lawyer with me. And what I find is the doors are off the hinges. What had happened is an FBI SWAT team had taken one of those battering rams, smashed the door off the hinges, proceeded to smash a fish aquarium, and my house was full of agents. You know, they were everywhere, they had machine guns. It was really something else. All over the floor, there was thousands of files. I edit a newspaper. One of the things I do is I keep files. There was thousands of files stacked everywhere, with agents pouring through the stuff, loading it into boxes, taking pictures of everything on the wall. You know, it was unbelievable. But it happened. And it happened not only to me, but it happened in 7 other homes and offices around the Twin Cities and Chicago. At the same time, 70 agents were fanning out across the United States, right here in North Carolina, California, other cities, questioning people, trying to intimidate people. And what they're really trying to do in our case is criminalize anti-war and international solidarity activism. Where this all begins, and I'll just give a quick narrative here just so people get a handle on it, is that organizing for the last protest around the Republican National Convention. The 23 of us who were called to the grand jury, all of us, virtually all of us, were heavily involved in that effort. And of course, we had speakers there who spoke in support of the liberation of Colombia and the liberation of Palestine. Of course we did. We're proud of it. We're glad we did it. We're glad we organized that protest. But little did we know in our ranks, there was a law enforcement agent who was later accompanied by another law enforcement agent who was, dutifully reporting on us and spying on us and entering our lives. And she was an agent. The U.S. Attorney has admitted that. And basically, kind of fast forward, an investigation into a protest becomes an investigation into material support of terrorism. And why is that? You know, the reality is as I said, the U.S. is an empire, and I, in my entire adult life, have always felt really good about saying, listen, I support the other side. I do. I support the people of Palestine. They have an absolute right to liberate their country, absolutely. And I support that struggle. And I'll always say it, or I'll say it forever, and I'll say the same thing about the people of Colombia. They have a right to liberate their country too. And that's really what they're angry about. There's no issue of material support as a normal person would understand it. Things like money, guns, they're not there. You know, no reasonable, what they're talking about is things that we've talked about and things that we have talked about openly. We've been shouting these things from the housetops for 10, 15, 20 years. You know, some of us longer. I'm a little bit older than most of the people. And really, that's what they're chasing this for. And I think it's kind of an upside down, kind of an upside down thing. You know, if you look at the world today, you see that it really cries out for change. You have the U.S. helping Israel occupy Palestine, neo-colonial regimes in places like Colombia. And of course, people want a better way of life. People in this country want a better way of life. And why shouldn't we be able to speak out and organize and help all of us achieve that? And that's what we're going to continue to do. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit and kind of jump back, because there's more than the 23. The 23 of us who were called to the grand jury arraignment. And there was the case of Carlos Montes, who was also, by the way, involved in organizing the Republican National Convention, who also encountered the same police agent named Karen Sullivan. And she was a law enforcement officer by the day. She and her minions, through the Joint Terrorism Task Force in LA, on May 17th, 2011, organized a raid on Carlos Montes' home. And basically it was Carlos Montes, you see his picture up there, founder of the Brown Berets, he's an activist who's been involved more longer than me. And his home was raided, torn to pieces. And I was one of the people who actually helped coordinate his defense work. And what we did in response, it was trumped up gun charges, they were bullshit charges, pardon me, I'm sorry. They were outrageous and outlandish charges. As they came up and we got to work and we began organizing a campaign around it. I think there's kind of 3 lessons from that campaign that are worth noting. You know, first of all, we did an excellent job in terms of popularizing Carlos, his great contributions to the community, what he's done, and why these charges were false and building public opinion around it. 2, we had excellent attorneys and we had a solid legal strategy that was aggressive. And number 3, we worked very hard to put all the pressure we could possibly put on the prosecutors. And at the end, the case resulted in a victory. And it was a success. And we view it as, in terms of this particular attack, it was a very important point in terms of pushing it back. And kind of to wrap up, I think, at this point, to say what is to be done kind of thing. We have a situation in the United States where there are literally hundreds and hundreds of Muslim, Arab, and other political prisoners. And it is vital in this period, that number 1, that we campaign and speak out for the release of each and every one of them. And the Holy Land Foundation is critical. It is the tip of the spear. It has to be pushed back and it has to be broken. It is a critical case. But beyond that, we have to build a democratic front that's capable of pushing back against all attacks on the right to organize and speak out. We have a lot to do, but I'm convinced it can be done. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, too, I'd like the speakers to come up, and we're going to start question. Yeah. questions and answers. So if you have questions, raise your hands and direct them to a specific speaker, and they'll answer them. So does anybody have any questions?
I have a question for the last speaker, which is, if you think that our organization is under pressure from the FBI, what can we do proactively to stop something from happening to us?
Yeah, I think the most vital thing that can be done is, given that there are literally thousands of people in the FBI, other intelligence agencies wandering around today, that's just a fact. I think each and every time someone gets a visit from the FBI, each and every time we encounter them when we're doing our work, when we're having our events and our programs, we need to shine a light on it. The reality is the FBI thrives on frightening people, getting people off in the corner, getting into a situation where, oh, I've done something wrong, I don't want anyone to know. Listen, the enemy knows. The enemy knows they've done this. They've been to your house, they've knocked on your door. They know it. Why shouldn't the community know that they're trying to intimidate activists who are standing up for their rights? And we've had a number of visits, people who have worked with the committee since the raids. And each and every time the FBI comes, we immediately do the press releases, we immediately do the news articles, and we really work hard to shine a light on it. There's actually one point I'd like to add. I should have put it in my initial speech, but for those who are curious, you should go to stopfbi.net, because there's kind of an interesting story with this, which is that when the FBI raided my home, they left behind a lot of their documents, including the operation plan for the raids, questions to interrogate people, and because my house is like an office, my spouse found them about 6 months later when she was working on data entry. And so we've reprinted the documents. You can find their interrogation questions. You can find many of the things that they had. How they did, where they parked their cars before the raids, who was in charge, this age and that, and the phone numbers and that kind of thing. So, anyways, that's a long answer, but the main thing is, let's drag this stuff to light.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Now, from the experience of your organization and from what you've seen, what do you know about FBI raids and interrogations on minors?
Perhaps an attorney might have more knowledge, but what I would say about the FBI is no good can ever come of answering your questions. That is the worst possible thing you can do. Right? You should simply say, I'd like to consult with an attorney, and my attorney can consult with you. In my opinion, there's no reason to consult after that either, but that's my opinion. But no good can ever come from talking to them. One of the things they tried to do during the raids is tried to trip people up. They had all sorts of questions. And the best thing you can do is not answer questions, because they're trying to get you in a situation where you're nervous. Listen, these guys are in the house with machine guns. We have a lot of questions, No, you don't have to answer questions. Mine is too.
Any other questions? Or comments?
I have a comment. It was my privilege to represent Ghassan Alashi, and my privilege also to work alongside John Klein. What I want to say to everybody here, it's important to bear witness in these cases. And what I mean by that is, when you hear about these trials, and these political trials, trials that are criminalizing religion, charity, speech, the Occupy movement cases, no matter how large or how small, it's important to go and bear witness. I think that many Americans don't know what goes on in these trials. I think that if there were Americans who sat in during the anonymous expert and members of the public and learned that there were people who could testify anonymously in a case where men's lives were at stake, that would anger a lot of people, regardless of the politics, etc. It just offends basic notions of fairness. Fairness that, sons and daughters have died for in this country. So I guess the only comment I would have is that it's important to bear witness, and as Noor was saying, John was saying, to be severely outspoken, but it just takes the right person. You've heard the stories tonight, you might want to share these stories, and it might just well be that you touch the ears of one person who can do something, who has some sort of influence. Maybe they have friends. Maybe they'll write a story about it. That story will reach a lot of people. This is how it's done. So my comment is to bear witness in these cases.
I guess the question and comment, one would be, if you wanted to write, or where can you direct the information that I now have about this case to an viewer that would want to hear it, or to hear the support would be building around it?
One response to your question, who you write to, who you talk to. I would suggest the goal is to somehow break through the sort of the fruit fly attention span of the national press and make this, and I'm talking now about the Holyland case, make it something that endures and grows. And I think as a kind of a starting point, write an op-ed piece for your local paper. Even if it's a tiny little, talk to your friends, write to your congressman. It'll just go in a file, I know, but write again in a few years. Now you, one person, writing a letter to your congressman, maybe getting something in the local paper, might not change things that much. But if we can multiply you by thousands, which is what we're hoping to do by talking to groups like this, it will start to have an impact. At some point there becomes a kind of critical mass that makes a difference, and that's what we're hoping to do. We're at the very beginning stage of this for the Holyland case. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case in October of 2012. Until that point, we weren't speaking out because we thought it would damage the prospects our clients had in front of the courts. Now we are, and the fact that we have all of you to listen to us and maybe leave from this room and write something, talk to somebody, that's a step forward, and we're going to keep doing this over and over and over. And I just hope all of you, when you walk out of here, don't do what we do too often, which is just say, God, that really sucks, and then go on to something else. It does suck, and so please help me do something about it.
Anyone else?
I just had a question and wanted to ask John to comment on something, and it just occurred to me that, in terms of the Holyland 5 case, it certainly must have been an unequal contest in the sense that the government, I'm sure, invested tens, if not more, millions of dollars into putting, to trying to do all the things that they do, starting from 2001. I'm sure it was quite a challenge. I'm sure we're putting together a legal team and fighting this and that kind of thing. It seems like an unequal contest, and that's not a question of lawyering skills or something, but in terms of resources the government's putting into this.
It was. Criminal cases tend to be unequal contests in that way. This one was particularly unequal. And it was made more unequal by, I'll just give you one example. I told you that there were 10 years worth of wiretaps. The conversations were all in Arabic. None of the defense lawyers spoke Arabic. So the question was, how do you listen to these calls and figure out which ones are helpful and which ones are potentially harmful? Well, the natural thing to do would be you have your client listen. They all speak Arabic. In fact, they were their conversations. Well, the government, in its wisdom, classified all the conversations. Not just the documents they used to get the wiretaps; those are always classified, but the conversations themselves. So these are conversations that Ghassan al-Ashi had with Shukri Abu Bakr, and the government said that conversation was classified. Now, as it happens, the defense lawyers who didn't speak Arabic had security clearances, so we could listen to these conversations that we couldn't understand. But the defendants, whose conversations they were, didn't have security clearances, so they couldn't listen to their own conversations. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you have to try to find at public expense Muslim-speaking, or Arabic-speaking translators who are willing to work, many, many hours, and who have security clearances. You know how many people there are like that who don't work already for the FBI? In essence, it was impossible. And so, in that respect, it wasn't just the usual inequality of resources, which all of us who do this kind of work deal with every day and can handle just fine. It was an enhanced inequality, of which that's one example. I can give you 10 others. But it's a good question. And, it's just another feature of these cases that is really troublesome from a standpoint of fairness and justice.
Anyone else?
And I just want to say one last comment, again, building on, I think, echoing on what Linda said and what John said, what everyone is saying here. And that is that I had, and I told this story too, but I actually had I lived in Texas, unfortunately, for quite some time. In fact, maybe about a dozen years, and I think I made that number smaller, it was more. But I lived in Texas for a while, and a few years ago, as the trials were happening, I was working at a tool distributing company as a graphic designer for a catalog. And as you may imagine, my employer was a hardcore Republican, and Sarah Palin had just come out, and she was greeted by thousands of people in the crowd, and he said, "You know what, Newark? I really love Sarah Palin." And I said, "You know what, John? That's great for you." And he said, "But you know what, Newark? Let me just tell you, your father, this is one of the biggest injustices that there are. Because let me tell you, he is an innocent man. And you should continue to say that for as long as you live, and I will continue to say it as well." And until now, I get emails from him, I get phone calls, but this is a man who is hardcore Republican, Texan, purebred, John Banks, that's his name, and really, was completely outraged. Anybody who hears this story, anyone who hears the facts, I think are going to be outright outraged by the story. And so that is why it's so important. Don't ever underestimate. I think us humans, us Americans, but us as a world community are very naturally very sympathetic. And if we do hear stories like these,